we all ready to go? Yes, we are. Let me introduce myself first of all. My name is Jenni Mills. I'm a writer amongst many other things, and I'd like to welcome you to this roundtable discussion on the question of freedom in a fanatic age. Now, I always think that people who chair discussions are really best advised to leave their own beliefs and opinions at the door when they come in. But I thought I'd start by sharing with you just a couple of thoughts. On the day that I heard about the Charlie Hebdo killings, I was shocked and horrified, as was everybody else, and I suppose my first instinct was, like a lot of people I knew, to stand up and declare with the French people that I saw on television that je suis Charlie. However, as the hours passed, I began to wonder if in fact I could or should comfortably make that declaration. I wouldn't go so far as to say that I was not Charlie, and I wanted to absolutely condemn the violence that had taken the lives of writers, journalists, as well as policemen and bystanders. But it seemed to me that there were other more slippery issues as well that needed to be discussed. So when I was invited to chair one of the discussions here, I was especially keen to be involved in this one, because it seems to me that this question of freedom of expression is one of the questions for our time. And perhaps it will always be the question of the human race, and in particular its writers and commentators, its satirists, its journalists, its artists, its historians, and of course its philosophers must grapple with. And I think we in England have grown accustomed to living in a society where you can open your mouth and say what you think. Is that a right? Is it a privilege? Or is it the necessary mark of a civilized society? Should we limit ourselves sometimes in what we say, or should someone impose limits on us? And of course, what might we learn from the two eminent men who were involved with this house in the 17th and 18th centuries, the first and third Earls of Shaftesbury, whose own times, of course, like ours, were characterised by religious persecution, political dissent, and violent revolution? Are their experiences still relevant today? So let me introduce the panel. With me are two historians of ideas and a historical archaeologist, and two writers whose work in different ways explores the issues of truth and freedom. So to go through them in alphabetical order, which seemed the fairest way of doing it, Andrew Agha is an anthropologist and archaeologist who teaches at the College of Charleston and leads excavations at the first Earls settlement on the Ashley River in South Carolina. Then Professor Justin Champion headed the history department at Royal Holloway, University of London, and still teaches there. One of his particular interests, I gather, is blasphemy and irreligion in early modern Europe. He once wrote...
Practical course.
He once wrote, "Historians have an intellectual responsibility to make every effort to connect the past to the public. History is ultimately a cultural form of public property." Mark Goldie is Professor of Intellectual History at Churchill College, Cambridge. He's written extensively on the philosopher John Locke, who we've already heard about, and who had quite a role in the education of the third Earl of Shaftesbury, and probably helped shape some of his ideas. Next we have Faye Weldon, CBE, Professor of Creative Writing at Bath Spa University, prolific author of novels, essays and plays. Her first book was published in 1967, her latest, Mischief, an anthology of short stories, earlier this year. She's often been described as a feminist writer, but her work, I think, defies easy labels. And she says of herself that she is not the delinquent she once was. But we'll have a go, because we're going to be a bit delinquent today. Gerard Woodward, also a Professor of Creative Writing at Bath Spa, is both a poet and a novelist. and like Faye, I think a purveyor of emotional truths. His second novel, I'll Go to Bed at Noon, part of a trilogy based on his own family, was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 2004, and then a year later his poetry collection, We Were Pedestrians, was shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize. So there we are, we have our panel, and again in alphabetical order, I'm going to ask each of them to start and present a short position statement of about 4 minutes each. Andrew.
Hello everybody here today. Appreciate that everyone's here. In today's day and age, we witness information traveling at speeds that would have made the most educated in the 17th century claim heresy. We can express ourselves as fast as we want to today. When news of the Charlie Hebdo attacks reached us in America, we learned of it right away. And just as fast, we judged the attackers and those who were responsible for the cartoon. To those on one side, it was a clear example of how the, quote, uncivilized world of Islam, end quote, is poised to attack what we in the, quote, civilized world, end quote, hold so dear, our freedoms, including the freedom of speech, and the ability it gives us to say whatever we want, even if it is inflammatory towards another free individual. In contrast, the other side wonders if we can go too far with our freedom of speech rights, and maybe we should be a little more reserved when other people's feelings, and especially religion, is being attacked. As an anthropologist, I cannot say anything about the word civilization because it is based in the 19th century when everyone who was not Christian and white was, quote, and unquote, uncivilized. A tenet of anthropology is cultural relativism, which states that when I study and learn from other people, I have to suspend my beliefs and morals to understand those different from me and my parent culture. This forces me to ignore my own biases and see people for who and what they are, and be okay with the fact that they are different from me and everything I know. Unfortunately, this way of thinking is not supposed to be permanent, but sometimes I wonder if people would respect and treat others better if they adopted this idea in their lives. Seeing people for who they are is a skill I learned early on in life. I did not have an average white American upbringing. My father immigrated to America from Beirut in 1971. He met my mother, a white Christian, shortly after, and I grew up in a multicultural household. He was a Muslim, but he did not force us to practice. As I grew up, I saw Arabs and Muslims continuously portrayed as heartless killers and terrorists on movies and TV. How many times did I personally get called a terrorist or a weirdo for not eating pork, or quote-unquote, one of them, when I had to sit and watch daily news updates in high school during the Gulf War in 1990? Rhetoric of this sort is thrown around today. Only now the social media has become a new venting ground for extreme hate, and it is affecting people in ways that it never has before. Would any of us have known a small satirical newspaper printed a cartoon of Muhammad the Prophet if it weren't for the internet? How many lives were lost due to our electronic age? Many call America the freest society on earth, but it is also the most judgmental and also the most proud, but for a lot of the wrong reasons. The latest Muhammad cartoon competition media stunt put on in Dallas a few months ago is sheer proof of how the freedom of speech can be used to instigate a violent attack in the name of religious intolerance. Yes, we are free, but when do we draw the line? What would the first Earl of Shaftesbury think of these events if he were alive today? He witnessed religious persecution almost his whole life. But it was Christian versus Christian, something people wouldn't fathom happening today. Even though the first Earl didn't mind sending orders to the people in Carolina, he did not believe that orders should be sent down from the church and that everyone should practice the religion they believed in. This idea of Ashley Cooper's was extended to even the enslaved Africans in that colony. What a powerful show of religious toleration. Even those owned by others, and stripped of all freedoms, had the freedom to practice their own religion. And that was almost 350 years ago. My, how the world has changed, from one where slaves were allowed to practice their religions, while today free people are persecuted for the same act. So in our quote-unquote advanced society today, why then has religious toleration eroded to the point where people can exercise their freedom of speech to attack another's religion? Are we too liberal in the use of this freedom? Should we be more tolerant and thus more respectful of the ways people want to practice their beliefs? In graduate school, we had a motto pinned to the walls of the anthropology department: free speech, not hate speech. If uttering hate is the mark of free speech, then does not hate beget more hate? Should this be a mark of true free society?
Thank you very much. Right, lots to discuss in that, but let's move straight on to Justin.
Thank you, Jenny. I'd like to preface what I'm going to say by one of my favourite quotes from the great poetess Patti Smith. Jesus died for somebody's sins, but not mine. My opening position is to explore and challenge what many people regard as the positive and benign legacy and consequences of something that used to be called the Enlightenment. Many have argued that this tradition was manifested most apparently in the celebrated defence of the rights of sincere religious belief and expression from coercive attentions of the state, but also from other hostile communities. And that right, of course, was described by John Locke, who I'm sure Mark will talk about. I have a profound problem with this view, and that problem is focused on the word sincere. That any conviction or belief, and that I'm really stealing from Thomas Hobbes here, should be held acceptable because held sincerely seems to me to beg a question, not of rationality, but of hubris. Essentially, as Hobbes said, believe me, because I'm right, and I'm special. Religion is often invoked as a trump card to terminate a discussion and grasp the moral high ground. Whereas, in effect, it's a speech claim that says, what I think is much more important than your beliefs, because I'm special and you're not. The claims to channel divine or revealed truth are, I'm afraid, specious nonsense, which ought to be subjected to the most robust scrutiny and active ridicule. Religion is, as historians have shown and many people have argued, a human historical construct. It's been made, mainly by men, as a device to secure their authority over communities and, at the bottom line, put money in their back pockets. Religion is a powerful institution, but it's also an institution of power. It's premised on false, delusory, or deceitful claims to inspiration and revelation. It's Hobbes' great insight that most people claim to be inspired through their dreams. Well, we could go some very strange places if we started creating religions out of many of our dreams, but let's not do that. It's premised on false, delusory, or deceitful claims to inspiration and revelation. It has in general wielded a pathological impact on societies throughout history. The war against religion, unfortunately, is not over. In fact, it has become more urgent as different brands struggle to become more visible. The defence of religious freedoms ought not to shield belief, but to promote a freedom from religion in all aspects of public and communal life. That's why I think, in one sense, the attack on Charlie Hebdo was so catastrophic, that it challenged one of the powerful states of Europe's commitment to something we call laicity. We may all have our fantasies, but they are probably best left unarticulated in public. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, some controversy already starting. Mark.
4 minutes each is like salt for the day, isn't it? You're getting a whole week's work. A bargain, that's right.
Two for the price.
The Anglican vicar in my village is a friend of mine. We send our children to the same nursery. We share the same babysitter. I am an atheist. I think that her religious beliefs are false, ridiculous. Not only false, but I think in some respects, like other religions, pernicious. But, in pursuit of my disagreement with her, I do not pin satirical cartoons of Jesus Christ on the church door of the parish church across the road. I never say to her, fuck your stupid religion. To do either of those things will not advance a conversation, will not create a space in which a mutual engagement about truth and falsehood can take place. On the contrary, it would antagonise. It would cause her to pull up her mental drawbridge, to feel affronted. We will both have withdrawn into a ghetto of the mind, a place of mutual incomprehension, of unbridged difference. Now, this is not to say I don't engage with her satirically. I josh with her. I tease her. Our discussion about our beliefs is always laced with irony and satire. But in such conversations, I constantly make a judgment about the boundaries and limits of utterance. There are many kinds of utterance and satirical acts that I exclude. And in making those exclusions, I am not engaging in self-censorship. The introduction printed in our booklets to this discussion refers to self-censorship. But I don't think I like that concept. It implies that the natural and proper condition is unbounded and limitless expression. But that, I think, is romantic anarchism of a childish sort, carte blanche for ugly, shapeless, expletive. Shouting abuse at a nurse in A&E is not freedom of expression. Every day of our lives we limit our expressiveness, and we ought to. We make constant judgments about when and how and whom to tease. To limit our expression is to make a judgment, and that judgment is guided by the principles of decorum and civility. Those are the preconditions of any constructive conversation. So to limit our expressiveness is not to self-censor. It's almost the opposite. It's to create, to fashion, to shape something that's discursively elegant, something persuasive, something that's rhetorically sympathetic to the audience with whom I'm speaking. I won't persuade you of anything if I make poor judgments about my utterances. If I'm crude, cack-handed, obscene, perhaps worst of all, contemptuous about your beliefs, then I haven't any hope of even beginning a conversation, let alone persuading you of my view. In a society such as ours, which is full of uncomprehending and sectarian ghettos of the mind, supported, I may say, by public taxation, we can come back to that, even beginning a conversation can be difficult. Does my defence of decorum and civility equate with what is commonly called political correctness, a fear of ever giving offence, an excessive tactfulness? Well, I don't think so, and I hope not, because civility is compatible, ought to be compatible with disagreement and disapproval, with expression of disagreement. I'm not arguing for a privatisation, a silence about our different views. On the contrary, the whole point of decorum is to build that stage, that arena, where we can disagree, fixing each other in the eyes. I want to be able to say Christianity is false, Judaism is false, Islam is false, but I have a responsibility to help build the right space for saying it. And I can't hope and I can't expect engagement from religious people if I fail the test of decorum.
Thank you. Hey, decorum, is that your theme?
But I was going to teach WO. He was going to teach. Oh no, I am right. Yes, well, I am a writer of fiction, you see, and it is my job to tell lies. But I think, I hope that by sort of, if you can only pursue enough lies, you might reach some truth which is hitherto unknown, which is the only way I can defend myself. But I am really here for life relief. And freedom obviously has its limitations. We are not free to offend, either in public or in private life. And these days I notice with alarm how the public now tips over into the private. Freedom of expression is less welcome than once it was over the dinner table, where people of like minds tend to gather together. Guardian readers don't welcome the company of Daily Mail readers, and vice versa. Dissension is bad for the digestion. I see even good manners, on which so much of our civilization depends, and you're a real sort of third rail person, begins to fail. Globalization makes matters worse. British families now split and divide over matters which don't concern them personally. I have a Jewish poet friend who is no longer welcome in universities because of the Israeli boycott. I know families who stopped talking over the yes-no Scottish referendum. Opposing views on Muslim extremism have people walking out of family gatherings, taking their children with them. People I know came to lunch the other day, and I had to restrain them from exchanging blows over, of all things, Greek debt. I find I have become wary of guests who speak their mind as public discourse spills over into private. Well-mannered people like me might well be part of the problem, not the solution. There's nothing theoretical about today's round table. Intolerance is alive and well and living with us. The days of politely sitting on the fence, I fear, are over. When I was 8, my father paid me ½ a crown for learning the first page of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty by heart. I didn't understand a word of it, but I liked the ring of it. I went back to Mill lately and discovered to my joy his theory of the tyranny of the majority, worse than the tyranny of magistrates, which he described as the tendency of society to impose its own views, its own ideas and practices as rules of conduct on those who dissent from them, who prevent the formation of any individuality not in harmony with its ways. I'd argue with the age of the internet and social media, the tyranny of the majority of the crowd has reached its zenith and is more to be feared than the rule of despots or even the bombs of fanatics. Freedom of expression in this country seems to be confined to what the BBC thinks is okay, what publishers, fearful of their profits, are prepared to print. Academic freedom is limited by what special interests are prepared to fund. In a commercial world, the tyranny of the crowd finds its voice in the censoring language of trolls, and we find we must bring back the authorities, the control of the magistrates, from which we once so struggled to be free, to silence them. That's true. I have new glasses. But it's been creeping up on us for a long time. In my early feminist days, I had an ultra-feminist typist who transcribed my handwriting and would reproach me if I wrote sentiments which differed from hers. I spent years careful not to offend her until I realized one day she was simply looking for offense, waiting to pounce on words that did not conform to what she saw as the common good. She saw what I wrote as propaganda, not fiction. She got fed up with me and left. I'm weak. I prefer to be liked than loathed. Freedom of expression has a hard time in a commercial age, let alone a fanatic age. Our right to it is theoretical. A writer has to pay the rent. In 1989, in the days of the Rushdie troubles, I wrote an essay saying I thought the Quran was not a suitable poem on which to base a modern society, and thought no more of it. How innocent we were all then, when we did not know our Sunni from our Shia and could mention the Quran without dread. 10 years later, the Runnymede Trust quoted the sentence and labelled me as an Islamophobe, which upset me, since this was the last thing I thought I was, or indeed am. A few unlikely people turned up at readings to disrupt the proceedings and berate me for my ignorance, and I spoke no more on the subject, like so many others accused, frightened and startled into silence. Mea culpa. And just a couple of years back, I wrote a Saturday play for Radio 4, The play was not a bundle of laughs about two girl students who conspired together to frame a male student for rape in order to pay off their university fees with the compensation money. It took 2 years to survive the labyrinthine processes of the BBC commissioning processes and was still not green-lighted. A friendly producer gave me a list of what now ticked the drama department's boxes and would pass something called compliance. So I took the play, upped ages by 10 years to suit the required demography, made the university Leeds, not Sussex. And the two girls lesbians are friends. And the two girls lesbians are good friends. The accused students are Muslim, not a devout Christian, and resubmitted the play. The only changes in the spoken text was that the girls said the occasional darling to one another, and the boy referred to Allah, not God. I did it as a joke, but it was taken seriously, green-lighted and transmitted within the month, though without comment or publicity, and so allowed to die quietly. No doubt I should have protested, argued, fought back, but I didn't. One gets tired. The forces of compliance are too great for me. Mea culpa. John Paul Sartre defined freedom as what we do with what is done to us, which sounds really good, but I struggle to understand what it means. By his standards, we writers of fiction don't do much. We do self-censor. We have to earn a living. One is reluctant to write what might make one unpopular. One has to live, one tells oneself. It is not pleasant not to be approved of. Video meliore proboque deta aurea sequor. I see the better way, but I follow the worse. Mea culpa again. And I am a Christian convert, converted from, in my later decades, converted from a liberal humanist tradition to a kind of metaphorical belief which does me no favours amongst the literalists and brings me into disrepute with the intelligentsia. I go to a village church 10 miles from here at 8 o'clock every Sunday morning in order to contemplate, along with the 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, the possibility of the essential benevolence of God and the universal harmony of mankind. Belief in the benevolence of God gets difficult in the modern age. Fanatics slaughter one another to prove they are right. The less fanatical but earnest walk out of other people's dining rooms, taking their children with them for fear of pollution. But I would think that these are symptoms, not the disease itself, which is a very human disease, namely the human tendency to make others wrong in order that we can be right.
Gerard.
Well, since I'm holding this thing anyway, I might as well use it. Perhaps we shouldn't even be having this discussion. Perhaps there should be no debate about freedom of speech and freedom of expression. The very act of questioning or examining those freedoms could be seen as a concession to the terrorists who attack those freedoms in Paris and elsewhere. Freedom of speech does not work well when it becomes conscious of itself, and the creative imagination can be fettered if it feels it needs to tread carefully. The great age of irresponsibility, the 60s and 70s, when magazines like Charlie Hebdo first began to flourish, can now seem like an irretrievable golden age of lost innocence. An attack like that which happened in Paris earlier this year shakes the confidence of a free society. Charlie Hebdo didn't just exercise freedom of expression. It was, through its own acts of extremism, an extremism of satire, an embodiment of that freedom. The actions of the terrorists was an attack by proxy on anyone who values freedom of expression, whether they be writers, readers, consumers and producers of culture in all its forms. Anyone who values thinking, imagining, dreaming, talking, dancing, was shaken by it. Who would have thought, when we were younger, in that irresponsible age, that we would now be living through the age of the war on cartoonists. That the confidence of the Free Society was shaken is evidenced by the second wave of reactions to the massacre in Paris. Crept in. Could the victims themselves be thought of as taking part of the blame for provoking people who had already threatened violence? The war on cartoonists had been underway since 2005, after all, and when the contents of Charlie Hebdo were looked at more closely, it seemed the cartoons, not just those depicting the Prophet, were not just shocking, but cruel, vicious, possibly racist. The Free Society became divided. Even fellow cartoonists had doubts. Gary Trudeau, in a well-known article in the Atlantic Monthly, seemed to blame the poor technical and aesthetic skills of the cartoonists as much as their ideology for their own violent deaths. Later, a number of distinguished writers refused to attend a Penn event where the surviving staff of the magazine were honoured for their bravery. They weren't comfortable, some of them said, with honouring people who drew cartoons like that. Like what? These were writers talking, people who should know how to read closely and interpret satirical texts, yet they failed to take into account the context of the material, to understand the relationship between author and character, or the complexity and layeredness of the satire, mistaking rough, sketchy drawing, what Trudeau called little more than graffiti, for rough, sketchy thinking. And most disappointingly of all, they failed to discern the difference between the content of a satirical cartoon and its target. They also seem to think that the reading public are not capable of making these distinctions either. As a society, we are no longer mature enough as readers to handle the apparent childishness of French satire. The terrorists themselves were not interested in the nuances of satire, nor were they motivated, in my opinion, by an offence against their religious sensibilities. Their aim was to undermine the West's confidence in its own imagination, to divide it and to restrict it, and to an extent they have succeeded. They have forced us into the position of doubting one of the most precious things we have. Freedom of expression is meaningless unless it includes the freedom to go beyond what is comfortable to hear or see. The freedom to be polite and inoffensive does not need to be protected. Manners and politeness are for personal interactions, not art. Freedom of expression must include the freedom to shock, to offend, to ridicule, to be impolite. It should not include the freedom to incite violence or hatred. A properly educated society, fully literate and inclusive, should be able to distinguish between the two.
Thank you very much. Now, listening to what you've all said, it strikes me that we've got here quite a measure of consensus, but also some very subtle and very interesting differences. And it's all very well to argue for politeness as a guide to some of our private utterances, but the fact remains that one person's free speech is another person's hate speech. How are you going to draw the line between the two? Mark? Intently at me.
Well, I was reflecting precisely on that as I listened to our last presentation, and perhaps there are a distinction to be drawn between the tolerance that we need for people to write and produce crude cartoons, and you spoke of the apparent childishness of French satire. That is one kind of activity which perhaps in a Voltairean mood we must defend always to the hilt. I'm referring to Voltaire's famous phrase, "I don't like what you do, I hate what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." I suppose that I was speaking, as has been remarked, in the mood of the third Earl of Shaftesbury, which refers to a different kind of ambition, which is not to shock but to persuade. Now, perhaps you, Justin, or others think that to persuade you need to shock sometimes. But I am interested in how we sustain conversations. And I would just add one further remark, that is hard to do. Paradoxically, despite the vast increase of quantity of information and knowledge and communication, by what I call the ghettoization of minds. It is so easy now to live privately within and among simply those who agree with oneself. We do that, we publicly support it through what I personally think is our disastrous policy of state-funded faith schools, which is, by another name, apartheid. And I find very odd that there is no public debate in this country about the public support of faith schools, which puts people from a young age into mental ghettos, which I find very dangerous for the kind of conversation I was defending.
By the way, when I talk about being polite in conversation, I don't want all of you to be polite. Jump in on each other and interrupt and argue and be quite frenzied. Don't wait for me.
Well, I'll take a hint from that. I mean, I'm pleased, Mark, in the sense that at the end you've come to your senses and realised that faith schools are an absolute disgrace and disaster, and there has been an attempt at a public debate about it, but of course we get bludgeoned over the head with, well, they're my children, I'll bring them up in the way I want to, as if a child's mind is the possession of a parent. And I mean, Dawkins is a pain in the bottom a lot of the time, but his point that if we said we're only sending our children to Tory or Labour or Blairite schools, people would be appalled and say, you're corrupting their mind. But I'm slightly reluctant to buy into your politeness decorum argument, because you can have a polite conversation and it can be enormously one-sided, because the other side are trying to chop your head off, because they don't see any responsibility or decorum to have a proper dialogue. And what strikes me, especially from in response to what Faye and Gerard have said, is how timid we are nowadays. In 1718, and Shaftesbury was almost certainly aware of it, the most radical clandestine text, that Traité de Trois Imposteurs, was circulated and eventually published, that claimed that Moses, Christ and Muhammad were devious political impostors. Now, this was still in print in Libre Pensée, the bookshop near the Sorbonne, into the 1930s. If you republish that now, the publisher would, well, they wouldn't, they'd panic.
Yeah.
But it's a historical document that makes the point of radical incommensurability. If we take religion seriously, Muslims, Jews and Christians do not like each other. They all think the other two are wrong. And Charles Blunt, I think, made the point, if the whole world falls into this sort of broad pattern of three different religions, then the majority of the world are wrong. And the rest of them want to kill them.
It's always wrong. It's what Ibsen said.
Yes. So best not have any religious sort of affiliation. And better support Southampton Football Club.
You have great trouble with the other side, who are not supporting you but are supporting the other, and those who people naturally go towards people who look like them, feel like them, talk like them, have the same intellectual level as them, and they gather together, which is why when they gather together in dinner parties you can manage an agreeable conversation, and your digestion is not
Can I bring in Andrew here?
You can say whatever you want to anybody, and you hope that there is some decorum. But if what you say is so offensive and the person walks away, the conversation is over.
Yes.
And that's where the contempt is created for that person. And so
Yes, no, well again, but then we're saying manners is what matters. So you're really just saying being polite to other people. And the other thing I don't know is, how can a child not be owned by its parents? Are you going to intervene in the state, have your state schools, have these secular schools? What are you going to do about uneducating the child's mind from its parents' mind?
That's a really complicated question, I think, especially when, of course, the greatest religion that dominates a child's mind at the moment is television, and the sort of filth that a young mind is corrupted by. How do we want to bring our children up? To be creative, to be imaginative, to be individuals, to resist all forms of authority.
But whoever we are, we want to bring them up to be like ourselves. And so, you know, it's lucky the draw. Yes.
I was a nasty little boy. I never. Ask my sisters.
Can I bring the conversation back just a moment to the question of cartoons, though, because it struck me that both Gerard and Andrew were talking about cartoons. The cartoon competition that you talked about in America, how does that differ? Does it differ from the kind of cartoons produced in Charlie Hebdo?
I tried to read as much as I could about what happened in Dallas, including the lead up to it, the media blitz that was created because that event was going to happen, and everyone knew that there was a strong chance that a repeat offense would happen, and it did. If you read into it, and I don't know how familiar everyone here is with that, it was all over our media in the United States, and it was, to me and a lot of other people, quite apparent they did it to instigate. But at the same time, they said, if we are instigating, it's because we have freedom of speech to do whatever we want. And so they use that as their kind of outward defense and saying, this is going to probably be offensive, but we have the right to do that, even if it means someone's going to attack. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had armed guards outside, knowing that there'd be the chance for retaliation. And it was very strange that the person who did it was not even an Arab, but identified as a Muslim, interviewed by the FBI some years before for some suspicious activities. And I was waiting to see who the person was. What nationality did they come from? What religion were they? And when it was apparent, I said, I said in my heart of hearts, I knew this was going to happen. Because the fanaticism it's reaching that point.
Gerard, what do you see as is there a distinction between those cartoons in Dallas and the cartoons in Charlie Hebdo? Are the people in Dallas entitled to have that cartoon competition?
I don't know enough probably about the Dallas example. I mean, I remember reading about it and thinking that sounds like a sort of deliberate provocation designed to invite an attack, which was not the position that Charlie Hebdo were taking. They'd sort of talked themselves into this terrible position on the magazine by defending, their right to free speech and the right to, depict the prophet. And once that is attacked, in theory, then they couldn't sort of back down somehow, and so they were, in a similar way, argued into a corner where they just either gave up or carried on exercising that right. And I mean, the editor was very strongly in, almost campaigning for his right to do that, and the right to, as a person in a secular society, to be free of any religious constraint. There's no organised religion can tell him what to do as an atheist in a secular society. And that must be true, surely. But if someone points a gun at you, what do? You say whatever they want you to say. It's very easy to destroy free speech in that way. So, yes, I think it's, it was a terrible sort of situation for them to get in.
Could I raise a thought provoked by that, where you refer to a secular society? I think there's a very interesting debate carrying on now about whether a liberal secular society is one which is simply neutral about religious belief and unbelief, as liberalism claims to be, or alternatively, as many religious people fear, that liberalism is in fact a quite dogmatic secularism. And I think it's worth widening our debate beyond speech and cartoons to think of other forms of expression on this boundary between the secular and the religious spheres. I'll give you just simply two examples. A air hostess with British Airways who was forbidden by her employers from wearing a crucifix round her neck on duty. Now that is a classic question of what are the appropriate boundaries between private belief and the wider, our wider public selves. in a secular cosmopolitan society. Now, I personally think, despite what I said earlier, that it was wrong to forbid her that mode of private expression even on duty. My other example, there are plenty of examples I can give, but another example is that Roman Catholic adoption agencies in this country have now had all their state funding withdrawn from them. Though they do very, very good work. I'm not a Catholic, but they do very, very good work in adoption. Because they refuse to allow adoption by gay parents. Now, maybe that's right and proper. And actually, in that case, I happen to take the other view, that state funds ought not to go to such bodies. But of course, one can see that the religiously committed, Roman Catholics in particular, are very offended and feel that secular society is not being neutral about religion, but actually hostile to the religious.
I think the freedom of expression should include the freedom of belief and the freedom to practice religious belief, and the freedom to express that, in the wearing of that necklace, as you brought up as an example. So I have a sort of twinge of anxiety when people talk about attacking, as we use the phrase, a war on religion. That that there's a war on religion to be fought still, which seems, maybe sort of going to an extreme that we're asking others not to go to on the religious side.
He's looking at you.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think, Mark, the issue, and this is the only instance I can think of where health and safety regulations have been put to good use. The reason why the air stewardess was invited not to wear her necklace was it was a necklace and might cause problems. It might get entangled, blah blah blah. It wasn't that it was a crucifix. Well, somebody might have grabbed her. It's like policemen don't have proper ties. I'm afraid I'm with Jefferson. He's a pretty big character. He believed, religion of all varieties. He says, there's 1,000 religions in the world and they're all wrong. And to try and prove his point, and I did this in a public lecture once at the Gresham Society, and they panicked like mad. Jefferson cut up his copy of the New Testament to take out the philosophically good ethical principles that Christ might have spoken, and had printed and delivered to every member of Congress a much shorter New Testament of about 22 pages. That, I believe, is still given to every congressman. Now, I said, wasn't that a brilliant thing to do? Boil down Revelation into a set of philosophical, moral principles. Maybe we should do that with the Quran.
Well, yes.
Oh, and everybody went berserk. It's a revealed text. You can't possibly do that. It's a book. And, as you say... Exactly. Oh, why not? I mean, it's a product of... Somebody wrote it. But this is offensive. Well, I don't get that. I don't get why that's offensive. I can find all sorts of things offensive. Fox hunting, that's a sort of religion. Certain sorts of trousers, all sorts of things. And shall I go to war to express my offence? I don't see why religion has this special quality. I love what's known as avant-grunge New York late 70s music. Can I foist that on the world? No, people would say this is an atrocious racket, it's offensive, but maybe I could build a religion around that. Perubu in particular is a very good example of that sort of music, and you could treat their texts as revelation. Why not? Well, because people would think you're a lunatic. And most of the critics of religion from Shaftesbury, and I was really thinking, those beautiful Shaftesbury emblems we looked at yesterday, they're the same as Charlie Hebdo's. They're just a little bit more sophisticated, and we treat them as great aesthetic responses. But I'm sure to a lot of high churchmen, they were filth. Absolutely, exposing the sort of enthusiasm and lunacy of religious organisation. But we've sort of accommodated that. So maybe in 200 years' time there'll be great conferences on Charlie Hebdo's beautifully crafted, images.
The whole thing seems to me to be in the form of epidemics. So there are sort of epidemics of communism. There are epidemics of the caliphate. There are epidemics of this. There are epidemics of that. And there are kind of belief structures which sort of sweep the world and then sort of fade away, as Marxism has up to a point. We may argue, but
Don't tell Zizek that.
no, I mean, it's what we're talking about is human behaviour over a large scale and over great time, and we're sort of at a certain point, and we can only see it sort of detail by detail and not in the great sweep of things. Perhaps we all did nothing.
A lot of us
go
have
away.
A lot of us have commented on the thought that in the recent decades it has become harder to be critical of religion than it was even, say, 30 years ago. And I think that's true. And I'd like to suggest a reason why I think that's the case. I think that a generation ago, people were more accepting of the idea that religion was a set of propositions which we can debate about the truth and falsehood. But religion has been turned into ethnicity. It's become part of people's identity. So that if I criticise, say, the Judaic religion, I'm now automatically treated as anti-Semitic. In other words, I'm not allowed to debate a proposition as true or false, or as possibly or partly true, partly false. Once religion has become internalized as a set of ethnicities, then the whole thing becomes more toxic and almost impossible to critique without critiquing people's deeper sense of themselves.
It's a part of culture. Morgan Tyler's original definition of what culture is, religion is one facet of that. So yeah, when you attack someone's religion, you're attacking their culture. Sometimes culture is stronger than religion, and thankfully anthropological studies have shown that there are things that are inherent to certain cultures around the world that exist before a religion comes in of a new kind. That culture then has the freedom to take what they think is best. The best example is the origin of the Taliban. The Taliban did not just form as an ethnicity, it did not form as a culture overnight. It started in small villages where people were practicing Islam in a slightly watered down fashion. And as I've grown up, I've been told the further you get from Mecca, the more diluted, more strict adherence to Islam becomes, to where this group of people called the Kohistani in the mountains between Afghanistan and Pakistan were only practicing technically two and a half of the 5 pillars of Islam. But they believed they were very devout Muslims, and they did everything in their society there to prove that to the world. When fundamentalism from Pakistan traveled west, as roads were created thanks to the whole Russian invasion in Afghanistan and the transport of guns and everything that followed, what America did over there, they started to learn new things, and they were teaching these people in small villages new ways to think about their Islam, and they ate it up because they knew they could be more devout, and they could prove to the world that they could be the best Muslims that they could possibly be. And as that fanaticism swept through these valleys and these mountains, the Taliban was born. What I see in looking at that is these people already had it in them. The studies have shown, great anthropological studies of several of these villages were performed over the last 60 years, and it's shown that they already had that inherent ability for blood revenge, and paired with Islam in a new form, they set the stage to become the Taliban, and we all know what happened after that. But it's culture. There's something inherent in culture where religion kind of can come in and out, depending on the people and the way they practice the religion and what they choose to do.
I mean, maybe there's a problem with talking about religion as though it's one thing, and it's. I'm sort of conscious of there being a very wide spectrum of religious belief and religious practice, you know, from the one extreme of something like Islamic State down to something like fairly Weldon. Faye's sort of metaphorical belief in, I'm fairly summarising that.
But that's quite an interesting point, actually. How much do you think the decline of Christianity in Western society, particularly in a country like England, how much has that contributed to all of this?
I think when we had the last census, wasn't one of the larger new religions that was identified the religion of the Jedi? Because people were taking a mickey.
Yeah.
Now, in 200 years' time, when some boring historian goes through the census, it's like, good Lord, they had these weird sort of cathedrals where they showed images, and then there were all these Jedi worshipping. Well, it's not the claim to be a follower of Jedi as plausible as being a follower of Christ or Moses?
Well, yes, I mean, I think that's true. And
Hobbits as well. The lightsabers don't actually work.
yes, I mean, there's a difference between the evangelical, authoritarian type of religion, which is trying to, spread the word or change society, to the more private Jedi worshipping aspect of belief.
Or the 17th century, the great hidden sectarian group who didn't want to persuade anybody and actively wouldn't tell you their beliefs unless you asked, but survived all the way through to 1981, was of course the Muggletonians. So maybe we all ought to be Muggletonians. Don't tell anybody about your religious belief, just sing a few hymns. And if you don't like somebody, write a little curse on a bit of paper and put it in their back pocket. And that's it. That's harmless.
On that point, I want to throw this open generally to the group, because I think these sort of discussions always work best if we get contributions to, oh, look at this, they would be longing to have their say. Well, the hand from I think that's, my glasses are broken today, so I can't see terribly well. There's a hand at the back there, which went up first of all. There we go.
I just wanted to sort of unpick some of the bits of the analogy that Mark made at the start. I agree that it would certainly be rude for you to go and pin satirical pictures of Jesus on your vicar's door. Just in the same way that it would be, I don't think it would be defensible for someone to come into my house and put swastikas up on the walls. They're sort of, and defend that as freedom of speech. However, that's not what the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists were doing. They were producing a magazine that people could either choose to buy or not to buy. They weren't shoving it down people's throats. And the other way that I thought the analogy broke down a little bit is your vicar, I hope, didn't have an AK-47. I think as Nick Cohen, the journalist, has said that we are all living under a de facto blasphemy law, which is not a law that is enforced by any courts. It's not on the statute books. Nevertheless, there's a de facto blasphemy law, and the punishment for it is potentially death. If you draw rude pictures of Muhammad, you potentially need police protection for the rest of your life. So my question was, if, as it seems some people were saying, the sort of limitation you impose on freedom of speech is offence rather than, say, incitement to violence, it's sort of going back to what Justin was asking. If that's the limitation, where do you draw the line? Because we all find lots of things offensive.
Well, I think I'd go back to a distinction I drew earlier. On one department, we are defending people's simple right to express themselves without getting shot or beheaded. And I think that liberal societies have to be totally ruthless when people use religion or any other ideology to try to kill us. I don't have any difficulties with that. And the great defender of religious toleration in the early Enlightenment, John Locke, wrote a famous book called The Letter on Toleration, and yet he was absolutely clear that if your religion leads you to subvert the very bases or elements of sociability and civil society, then you are enemies of that society and must be treated as an enemy of that society. That is absolutely clear. But that's a rather different question from how you begin to engage in conversibility and persuasion. And I don't happen to think that rude and childish cartoons is actually going to work to persuade anyone of anything.
question. Ladies just there on this end. Yep.
I was interested in the idea of timidity that Justin raised, and I felt in terms of in recent decades we've been so keen to be seen to be non-racist that we've known the Portuguese things, and because they were generally Asian perpetrators, everyone was too scared to say. Do you not think this is a part of our polarisation with these ideas of offensiveness and racism and so forth?
I think it is a problem, and I mean, as Mark said, it's become a sort of ethnicised problem. It's often people who then go on to say stupid things. Some of my best friends are Muslims, and I quite happily play cricket, with Hindus and Lord knows whatever. Because religion doesn't matter on the cricket field. If there's a cricket ball coming at you at 90 miles an hour, you expect somebody to catch it or whatever. The question of these child abuse things is very complicated, and of course, if you're a white Tory politician, you've been let off investigation as well. I think that there's a profound sort of issue there. But the timidity. I made a radio programme that was broadcast earlier in the week that we went to Brick Lane and looked at the East London Mosque, which was initially a Huguenot church and then a synagogue and is now a mosque. And in one sense, that hybridity of that area, where people are living together, there's a great big sort of imam shouting tower going on, but everybody is living together without complexity or difference. And I think as long as, it's part of, I guess, what Mark was saying, if individuals can communicate and invite each other round to their houses and not want to stab each other, then we can perhaps live together. But, a lot of the problem is we're not just ghettoised in our minds, we're ghettoised in where we live. So, I don't live in Bradford, but I'm sure there are parts of Bradford and Birmingham and wherever where it's very difficult not to feel anxiety about different parts of the community. But as soon as you know other types of people, they're just human. They might dress weird sometimes, but then, as far as I'm concerned, most people dress in eccentric ways. I would be the standard of what's correct. I think it may be a generational thing. Offence, isn't that what great art does? I grew up to be a sort of young adult when punk was happening, and the Sex Pistols and the Slits and all of those different groups challenging not just Daily Mail sort of authority, but mainstream adult society. The end of civilization was due. The Sex Pistols could never play anywhere because local communities had the evangelical preachers out saying, these people will eat our children. And it seemed to me that form of protest, maybe it's not, it's protest rather than a war. Why can't we protest? If people get offended, it's their problem.
And it's dangerous, isn't it? Communities do suddenly sort of turn on each other, and the neighbours suddenly, decide they're that sort of person, that's that sort of person, and murder each other. And you look at the Tutsis and the Hutus or whoever, and it's dangerous. I think a lot of the fear of racism is an actual physical fear that people have. It was, as within the Rushdie business, it was the physical fear of the publishers that they were going to be killed, which made the whole sort of row happen. So I think the basic of it is just self-protection, and that you can't sort of ignore it and try to be terribly nice to everybody all the time.
I'd like to bring in the gentleman in the blue shirt there.
Thank you. I'm a bit annoyed because you tend to construe the Charlie Hebdo killings as a response of Muslims to hate speech. But we had 3 days of murder, in Paris. 19 people were killed. 19. One of them, a policeman, Ahmed, he was executed. He was executed. probably because there was no compassion because he was an Arab, and obviously an apostate. And Jews were killed because they were Jews. So we should wonder about the motivations of the killers. It's not about freedom of speech or Islam. It's a political program, and religion is an instrument for politics. So the question is about whether what they think is religious law is or is not superior to civil law, and especially to democracy.
I mean, I think how our press essentialises Islam into one sort of project and ISIL at the sort of public face of that is a catastrophe. And if we think just about what's happened in the United States in the last few months, where 9 Christians were murdered in a church, and then since then there have been a further, I think, 12 African American churches attacked and burned. Is this just racism, or is this a religious crime? And why isn't it high up our public media? We don't care, because it can't be put into the nice little stories we want to tell about the West being sort of threatened by some sort of fundamentalist, fanatical group.
All you need is an opening, and these people are hungry. We see them on TV and read about them in all of the press, and they're waiting for that opening. And the cartoon provided that. The intent and everything else, and all of the people who died, that's the result of that event, giving them the excuse to do something like that. But the question the world has is, why don't they just do that everywhere, at any minute, in every country? Why did something like this event, a free speech happening, have to create this motivation? I don't know. I wonder about it.
Pink shirt.
Well, I
Yeah.
would make exactly the same point, that I felt the discussion was somewhat naive about just Charlie Hebdo. I've actually read Charlie Hebdo, I've seen the cartoons, and they actually don't just attack the prophet. And by the way, you shouldn't depict the prophet in any form. I mean, that's a farce, but my point was exactly the same.
But it's not true either, because there's plenty of 13th,
Yeah,
12th,
I know,
14th
I know,
century
I know.
Islamic depictions of the Prophet. It's just part of
It's
a
not in
very
the Quran.
complicated... Yeah.
The Quran does
Yeah.
not say to do that.
We've got a gentleman with his hand up at the back there. Yep. Yes.
I think the problem fundamentally we have, and this is why of all the animals on the planet, perhaps the human animal has been most successful, because we've mastered the anatomy of hate. And we do that extremely well. And then we have to wrestle with the concept, be it religious, morality, state, legality, how you try and prevent or restrain an animal that delights very often in hatred, as humans do, whatever it may be, as was brought up, Charlie Hebdo. I wonder how much debate there has been in the past 30 years of America looking in on itself when state buildings are being bombed by ultra-nationalists because they hate the federal state. One part of the Midwest hates another part of the Midwest because they...
Forms of religion, more insidious. The politicisation of particular religions into holy violence is the problem. And, I don't think American foreign policy or even British foreign policy has really helped this issue very much, since they're dropping drones on innocent sort of civilians, which is going to inevitably feed into this cycle of hatred that's behind a lot of the violence. And, be aware that from, I think, a month ago, every school teacher, every parent, every university lecturer, is meant to be reporting under prevent legislation on whether they think any of their students have been radicalised. And this is pretty much an Islamophobic project, because of course, you know, one could say, what is it to be radical? You know, wear a silly waistcoat, or to, you know, read Weldon, or what is it? But if we're going to start having to write reports on 6-year-olds, you know, this 6-year-old looks like a dangerous radical to me. What were they playing in the playground with rucksacks?
People wearing a waistcoat like yours were going around throwing bombs. You can bet your bottom dollar.
Waistcoats will be banned.
You'd be looking at now.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, there's an idea. Sponsorship.
Right, can we have one last question, because we're getting towards lunch. Oh, I've got two, haven't I?
It's persuasiveness, but there's an argument among historians of ideas that secularism and liberalism were a particular outgrowth of a Christian culture and of Christian arguments, and indeed there are those who want to say that it's something peculiar, a peculiar achievement of Christianity, paradoxically. And that, if true, would play into those who would want to say, as I hinted earlier, that liberalism is not simply a universal, detached, neutral doctrine that is all-inclusive, but in fact is quite a dogmatic project itself, which, although secular, has grown out paradoxically of a particularly Western and Christian setting. And I think that quite a lot of religious stroke cultural groups across the rest of the world regarded liberalism as a peculiarly European and phenomenon, which they would regard with suspicion.
Well, I think at this point we're probably all very hungry, so I'd like to say thank you to all of you for your questions. Thank you, of course. I'm not sure if the applause was for the panel or for the suggestions let me thank our panel individually. Andrew Agha, Justin Champion, Mark Goldie, Weldon and Gerard Woodward. I'm not sure we've reached any conclusion, nor perhaps that we ever could, but surely the point has to be, in the airing of the subject, the striving towards some kind of light, or perhaps, if I can quote the third L, the eternal measures and immutable independent nature of worth and virtue. Thank you all. Enjoy your lunch.